Hi, I'm Jerry Skinner, and today I want to talk about the little historic Civil War town of Holly Springs, Mississippi. Holly Springs was unique, and one of the things is that it produced during the Civil War 13 Confederate generals. 13 come from this little town. And of course, the major thing that happened in Holly Springs was that General Grant come in to set up a supply depot. Now, when he captured Holly Springs, he was bringing supplies in from everywhere. Actually, they had $1.5 million at that time worth of supplies that was to furnish his army. His plan was to go by land and take over Vicksburg. That was the idea. The way he was going to do it is he was going to hop from one little town to the other. Take that little town, establish a supply line from Holly Springs to the next little town, on and on like that, till he reached Vicksburg. Well, he established the depot. He had a 40,000 man army that he had to feed, clothe. He had to supply ammunition. So it had to be a huge undertaking to get all those supplies into Holly Springs and get it set up. Soon after that, he moved 30 miles south to the little town of Oxford. That was his first step in being able to take Vicksburg. Well, when he went into Oxford, he left 1,000 men to guard the supply in Holly Springs. They didn't know it, but Confederate General Earl Van Dorn brought in 2,000 of his cavalry and swept in and took Holly Springs back. Now, the Union soldiers that was there was either killed or left. They run out because they were overwhelmed, but not that much overwhelmed. They had 1,000 troops, and Van Dorn only had 2,000. But anyway, they were caught completely by surprise. So when he took Holly Springs and the supply depot, he took all of the supplies that he could carry and take. At that time, when he left Holly Springs, he was the best supplied unit in the whole Confederate Army. What he couldn't take, he either burned or destroyed in one way or another. Now, when Grant learned what Van Dorn had done, it just blowed his plans to take Vicksburg by land completely. Because we know that he ended up going back to Memphis and then going down to Mississippi, and that's a whole different ordeal there. But that's the way he did. He had to go by river then. Let me go back in 2 days. Think about this. 2 days after Grant left Holly Springs to go to Oxford, his wife, Julia, their 4-year-old son, Jesse, and a personal black slave, that was Miss Grant's slave. And she had been, really what it was is Miss Grant's, Julia's mother and daddy lived in Missouri, and they owned several slaves. And Julia was actually raised up with this slave servant who was named after her. They both had the same name. And so everywhere she went, and this was an understanding that Grant had before he took his command. He said, "I'll take it, but every time I get a chance, I'm bringing my wife in. I want to see my wife ever so often. And they agreed to it. They said, okay. So that's what he did. As a matter of fact, Julia, Miss Grant, traveled approximately 10,000 miles to see her husband during the Civil War. He would keep her a few miles back behind where she'd be safe, but she followed his army, and he would send messages to her, you can come for a few days and what have you. And she did it. So 2 days after he had left Holly Springs, she shows up in Holly Springs and just missed him. Of course, he left her a letter that said, I'm sorry I had to go, and I'm sorry I missed you. Maybe we can get together before I leave Oxford. That was the idea. And the aide to General Grant had, this was a procedure that he used all the time. Through the Civil War, when he would go into a town, his aide would go and scout out homes for him to stay in while he was there and be able to set up his headquarters. Now, he did that. That was his way of doing it. And so there's no exception to Holly Springs. They found the home of Colonel Harvey Walter. Now, the Walter place is what they call his home. Colonel Walter was, of course, a Confederate colonel. He had already moved his family over to Alabama where they would be safe. But they left their home in charge of a friend of Miss Walters, a lady by the name of Pugh Govern. Now, Pugh was a friend and a caretaker at the same time. Well, when the Yankees come in and they decided that they wanted a home, actually they was gonna have it as a headquarters for General Grant, but he wasn't there long enough. He had an emergency and he had to get down to Oxford. But what they did was they said, okay, he's not here, but here comes Miss Grant. So we're going to let her stay here. And she wrote later on after the war that Mrs. Govern was a very nice, respectable Southern lady, as a lot of Southern women are. So it's amazing about the Civil War. They even respected their enemies. And of course, you don't get that today. Hardly. But then it was more chivalry. Really, everything was going fine. She had been staying there waiting for word to be able to go to Oxford to see her husband. But in December, here comes Confederate General Earl Van Dorn. Now, Van Dorn got the word that Miss Grant might be at Walter Place. And that's what they call the home of Colonel Walter Place. So, and it still exists today. So he sent a colonel plus 11 men to Walter Place. Go and see if it's true, if Miss Grant is actually there. Now, the story gets more complicated because there's several stories about what actually happened next. Some say that when the troops got there, that Mrs. Govern come out and stopped them and asked, look, leave her alone. She's not hurting anything. Go back and tell your general that she is not going to do anything. She's not going to run. She's not doing anything but just. So they did, and Van Dorn said, "Leave her alone. Leave her alone." Now that's one story. Another story is that they actually went in and found her there. And when they found her, they said, "Well, what the heck are we going to do with her now?" So when they told the general, Van Dorn said, "Leave her alone. Just leave her." I mean, what was he going to do? You know? And I mean, they had respect for one another, and they didn't involve women and kids in war then. Of course, now it's different. We got women fighting in war. I don't know. Anyway, that's one story. Now, this we know is true. Whether they found her or not, some say that this governor hid her where the soldiers couldn't find her. We do know that Mrs. Grant's carriage, one she used all the time to chase her husband around the South with, was still there. We know that the horses were still there. And we know that her trunks with all her clothes in it was still there. Of course, the story was that she had left the day before. She would have had to leave in an awful big hurry, not to take her clothes and not to take her carriage. But she had her 4-year-old son, Jesse, with her. And there's another official story that Mrs. Grant wrote later. She said, I was downtown shopping. What? Yeah, she said, I was downtown shopping, and then I got this telegram from my husband from Oxford. And he said, get down here as soon as you can, and maybe we can spend the weekend together. So she goes right then and catches the train to Oxford. And so she had just left the day before Van Dorn happens to ride in. Now, I don't know, just take it the way you want it. I don't know. But anyway, there's several stories to actually what happened. I know one thing. I know that General Grant would not want anybody to know that the Confederates caught his wife and captured his wife. I also know that General Van Dorn would have a hard time explaining to his men why he let her go. So a good story for him was, hey, we looked, she wasn't there. But they did burn her carriage because that was one of the orders from war, that you destroy anything that the enemy can use. And so that's sort of the way it went. I don't know, they say that that in 1878, Colonel Harvey Walters moves back home, of course. It's after the Civil War. But unfortunately, the yellow fever struck in 78. And Walter and his 3 sons died from yellow fever. Now, the house is still there. And the owner now allows tours through the house. And he caters to weddings and things like that on the ground. So I tell you what, let's take a look at Walter Place and the Mississippi town of Holly Springs. It's hard to go to Holly Springs without telling the importance it played during the Civil War. This is one town that gave the South 13 Confederate generals. On November the 29th, 1862, Union General Ulysses S. Grant captured Holly Springs and set up a base camp and supply depot. This was to help his land campaign to capture Vicksburg. But on December the 4th, General Grant moved south to Oxford. 2 days later, his wife Julia and their 4-year-old son Jesse, along with Miss Grant's family slave, Julie, yes, I said along with Miss Grant's personal slave, Julie, arrived in Holly Springs. General Grant had his wife and son follow him throughout most of the war so that he could see them every once in a while. He left a message for Julia saying that he was sorry to have missed her, but General Grant's aide-de-camp, Captain Theodore Bowers, secured the home of Confederate Colonel Harvey Walter, who had moved his family to Alabama for their security. However, the Walters had left a friend, Mrs. Pugh Govan, in charge of the house. When Mrs. Grant arrived, she was welcomed by Mrs. Govan, and they became friends. Julia stayed on the bottom floor in the room on the far left. She described Mrs. Govan as a fine, noble woman, as a lot of Southern women are, she said. Stories say that Colonel Walters offered General Grant the use of his home. After all, he was raised in Ohio and came to Holly Springs at the age of 19 because his wife was from here. He was always against secession. He had become an attorney and president of the Mississippi Central Railroad before the war. On December the 20th, 1862, Confederate General Earl Van Dorn captured Holly Springs. He destroyed millions of dollars of supplies he couldn't carry with him, interrupting Grant's plans to take Vicksburg by land. When General Van Dorn heard that Grant and his wife had been staying at Walter House, he sent Colonel John Griffin and 10 men to check the house. The story goes that Mrs. Govan met the soldiers at the gate and persuaded Colonel Griffin to allow her to keep the personal baggage of Mrs. Grant's and send it on to her later, she said. Julia wrote years later that she had left to meet her husband a couple of days before Van Dorn arrived. Other stories say it would be embarrassing for the wife of the Union top general to have his wife captured by the enemy and then let her go. Some believe that Mrs. Govan hid Julia and company so she could not be found. Other stories say that she was found, but General Van Dorn let her go. I'm inclined to believe the latter, because when General Griffin arrived at Walter Place, he found Mrs. Grant's personal carriage still there, along with the horses that pulled her carriage, and soon after found all of Mrs. Grant's baggage. We do know that Colonel Griffin ordered her carriage burnt and confiscated her horses, according to orders not to leave anything the enemy might be able to use. However, he left her personal baggage untouched, and it was later returned to Mrs. Grant. After the war, Colonel Walters and family moved back to the house. But 12 years later, Walter and his 3 sons died from the yellow fever epidemic in 1878. The house will remain in the family for over 100 years. In 1983, Mike Lynn, general manager of the Minnesota Vikings football team, bought Walter Place for a reported $11 million. It is said that up until that time, it was the most ever paid for a home in Mississippi. After Mike passed away in 2012, His wife Georgia auctioned off furnishings and valuables, and in 2014 placed the house up for sale. The house remained empty until 2019 when Terry Cook from Memphis bought Walter Place and renovated the house and grounds so that people could visit and have weddings at this historical old home.